Dear Biker, I'm finally ready to talk. I've never shared this story anywhere, but I feel like it's time. You see, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, deep in the Appalachian region. If you know the area, then you can probably guess the place. It's one of the most heavily wooded spots in the middle of PA. This happened sometime between 2014 and 2016. I can't remember the exact year, but I do know I was with my ex-girlfriend. We'll call her Carrie. At the time, I was about 13 or 14 years old. And up until now, I've only told maybe 6 people in my whole life. One night, I was leaving work with Carrie's grandma. I was just being the typical teenager, trying to smooth talk my girl while we drove back to her grandmother's house. It wasn't far, maybe 7 or 8 miles. Carrie's grandma owned a small barbecue restaurant where I worked, so I was used to seeing black bears around the area. I'd never seen one with mange before, but I promise you, what I saw that night wasn't a bear. I've hunted most of my life. Now, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I do know the local wildlife, including the rare piebald deer population. And what I saw that night didn't fit anything that I knew. We were about 2 or 3 miles from our house, and we had just turned off the main road and onto a smaller back road that cut through the woods and farmland. Not too far down, maybe a quarter mile or so, we passed an old pond that I used to fish at, and that's when it stepped out of the woods. It was pale, almost an off-white and slightly hunched over. Now, it wasn't huge, maybe 5 foot 6 inches at the tallest, but it could have been closer to 4 feet. Whatever it was definitely humanoid, moving on 2 legs, though I never saw its face. It sprinted across the road fast and leapt over a sign at the end of a long wooded driveway. Carrie's grandmother immediately pulled to the side of the road and said, "What the hell was that?" And then it was gone, and I never saw it again. I didn't notice any claws, glowing eyes, or anything like that, just a pale humanoid figure, running. Back in the early 2010s, the first thought that came to mind was the rake. It wasn't impossibly fast, but it moved like an adult man in a dead sprint. If we had been going just a little faster, I might have gotten pictures of it wrapped around the bumper of her Hummer. That's how quick it was. After that, things went quiet in the woods. The coyotes stopped howling for a few months. I wish I could say something more dramatic happened, but honestly, this shook me to my core. Now, as I'm about to turn 24 and transition out of the military, I served in the infantry recon. I feel like I can finally share it. The whole thing was just so quick and surreal that, well, I spent most of the time trying to keep my composure. I'm definitely no writer, and I'm not looking for attention. I still go out in those woods by myself, and I'm working on getting into wildland firefighting. I hadn't thought about this night in years, but I was recently reading about the Mount St. Helens and the strange things found in the woods. That's when the memory hit me like lightning, and it all came rushing back. Take it as just a chilling story or an anecdote. If you'd like to read it on your channel, I'd be honored. If not, well, that's fine too. I'm just glad to finally get it off my chest. Signed, Hector. Dear TB, I've lived in Houston, Texas for over 30 years now, and I've had more than a few strange and scary experiences here. But the one I want to share with you took place on the island of Antigua around 1987 when I was in my early 20s. At the time, my girlfriend and I were both attending college in upstate New York, and we had come home to Antigua for summer break. For context, my girlfriend was about 5'5" and maybe 120 pounds, soaking wet. I was 5'10" and around 190 pounds of lean muscle back then. Sad to say, but I don't look like that anymore. But that detail becomes important later on. Well, one night, we decided to walk to the drive-in theater, about 1.5 miles from my house. On the island, most people walked if they didn't have a car, so this wasn't unusual. The theater sat on a hill where you could either sit in a stadium-style seating or watch from your car. The movie ended around 9:30, and by then the sky was pitch black, filled with stars. For us, the walk home was almost as enjoyable as the movie itself. No light pollution meant you could see the entire sky. Well, to get home, we had to cross an open field where cows scattered around in the dark. We carefully made our way through without bumping into any, and eventually came out onto a road that circled the downtown park. We went right, moving counterclockwise since that would bring us back out on the factory road, where my house was a little over 1 mile away. As we came around a little bend, my girlfriend, walking on my right, suddenly said, "Hey, do you see that?" And she pointed toward a clearing where the park was being expanded for construction. There, in the dark, I could just barely make out the shapes of equipment, backhoes, graders, and dump trucks, sitting there in the lot. Nothing seemed too unusual, but immediately my instincts screamed that something was amiss. I told her to stop looking that way, pick up the pace. Well, of course she ignored me and kept staring into the dark. So I grabbed her arm and pulled her along. And that's when she shouted, "Oh my God, I see a light near one of the vehicles." Fear, well, it hit me instantly, but curiosity made me ask what it looked like. And her voice shook as she said, "It's a woman, and I can see through her." Well, that was enough for me. I told her to look away, stay quiet, and walk faster. But before we could get far, she suddenly clutched at her throat and gasped, "Something is choking me." And I turned to see her fighting invisible hands, clawing at her neck. Then she collapsed there unconscious, right there on the road. Adrenaline and sheer survival instinct suddenly took over. I quickly hoisted her over my shoulder and sprinted down the road toward Factory Road. She was dead weight, but fear gave me speed and strength that, well, I didn't know I had. After about 50 yards, she came to, and I set her down while still moving. Without saying a word, she just grabbed my hand and then bolted right along beside me. We didn't stop running until we reached Factory Road. We ran straight into the middle of the road, just to stay in the headlights of the oncoming cars. A car slowed and we stepped aside, and then we continued home quickly, too afraid to even speak. The silence between us was as heavy as the air itself. When we finally got back to my house, she went straight to my room, laid down, and passed out cold. I called her father right away and explained what happened, and he said he'd come get her as soon as he could. A little over an hour later, he arrived, and I had to wake her just to get her into the car. She still said nothing. The next morning, when I called her house, I was told that she hadn't woken up until around noon. When I finally got to speak to her, she brushed it off, told me she was fine, but still refused to talk about it. Well, life moved on. School, vacations, everything. 2 years later, the memory had faded. And that summer, we went back home again. And foolishly, we walked the same route from the drive-in. When we reached that same stretch of road, we looked at each other in shock, realizing where we were. I asked her if she saw anything. She said no, but I feel something around my throat. I didn't wait. "Run," was all I said, and we took off just like before, straight to Factory Road, right into the middle of the street, under the safety of the headlights. Well, that was the last time I ever went back there. We eventually broke up in 1991, and only once more did she ever acknowledge that night. She never gave me any details, but as for me, the memory is as sharp as ever. I'll just never forget the sight of her clawing at her own throat and collapsing there in front of me. The terror that drove me to carry her away at full sprint. But what baffles me is how we managed to forget about it, only to repeat the exact same mistake just 2 years later. To this day, I still have more questions than answers, and maybe that's for the best. Thanks for your time, TB. I enjoy hearing you read these stories with your cadence and accent. It brings them to life. Signed, Shannon. Hey biker, I'm from Henderson, Nevada. I live in a subdivision here, and well, right behind my backyard are the railroad tracks. I've got neighbors on both sides and across the street, but my yard backs right up to those tracks. Because of that, we often see people walking along them. And every now and then, something happens back there. When it does, the cops usually show up. Sirens, lights, the whole thing. Well, one night, I noticed commotion behind my house. Being my usual nosy self, I wanted to know what was going on. I grabbed a stepladder and looked over my back wall. The police were shining a spotlight, scanning back and forth like they were searching for something. Well, that's when I saw it. The first thought that popped into my head was werewolf. Now, I don't even know what a real werewolf would look like, but that's exactly what came to mind when I saw this thing. I immediately grabbed my cat, put her inside for safety, and went back out to keep watching. The spotlight swept across again, and I got another look. Whatever it was had a hunchback, kind of like how people describe a chupacabra, but to me this thing looked more like a werewolf. After that, everything just stopped. The cops packed up and left, and the next day, there was nothing in the newspaper. No mention of anything strange. Of course, I doubt they'd ever put werewolf spotted in Henderson in the paper anyway. Thanks for reading. Signed, Garrett. Dear Tattooed Biker, I grew up in New Mexico, and I still live here. My whole life, I've heard stories about skinwalkers, and I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable on the subject, and I've always found them creepy yet fascinating. I talk about them a lot, even though one of my Navajo friends insists that I shouldn't, and always leaves the room whenever I bring them up. I live in a third-story apartment in North Albuquerque. The area is pretty busy, even at night, with a lot of restaurants, businesses, and even a shopping mall nearby. Well, one night I was chilling alone in my apartment, eating cereal and watching Netflix. It was around 1 a.m., and I was just about to go to bed when I hear a barking outside my window. That's not unusual. Our complex allows dogs under 40 pounds, but this barking sounded, well, wrong. Almost like the dog was drowning. Like half the barks were coming from underwater. I slowly crept out onto my balcony to check it out, and I spotted the source. At first glance, it looked like a dog, but enormous. The size of one of those Russian mountain dogs. I've never seen a dog that big in person. It was in a dimly lit, grassy courtyard of my complex. The lights were old, dull yellow bulbs, so I couldn't make out much detail. All I knew was that it was huge, very furry, and seemed to be looking directly at me. The moment that I stepped out onto the balcony, the barking just stopped. We stared at each other for what felt like 2 minutes, until a car honked loudly on the nearby highway. That's when the creature, this thing stood up on its hind legs and then sprinted towards the small park near my complex. I was completely terrified. Honestly, I've never been that close to actually soiling my pants. Of course, my first thought was that I'd just witnessed a skinwalker. The strange part is I've never read or heard about skinwalkers appearing in such a busy urban area. The scariest part? My Navajo friend has always warned me that talking about skinwalkers attracts their attention, so now, thanks to this, I just feel extra paranoid. Thanks for reading. Signed, Tommy.
He's got skulls on his arms, flames on his chest, rides a steel horse, won't ever rest. Chasing whispers through the foggy pines, searching for truths that slip through time. Moonlight bends where he rolls, the shadows speak. They've got souls, inking shadows, leather and lore. He's knocking on the other world's door. Bigfoot's howl, dog man's glare, man in black just vanishing there. Inking shadows, truth to find, paranormal trails in his mind.